"Just kill me fast," she said. And the words were so quiet they nearly dissolved into the wind. Yet they struck the lonely soldier with a force stronger than gunfire, because they were not spoken in fear or rage, but in the tired finality of someone who had already surrendered everything that once made life negotiable. He had been walking alone for days through a land chewed raw by war, where fences leaned like broken teeth and trees stood blackened and split as if lightning had struck them from the inside, and he had stopped counting the miles, because counting reminded him that every step carried him farther from the men he had buried and closer to nothing he could name. When he saw her, at first he thought she was another shadow, a trick of exhaustion, a bundle of rags caught against a stump at the edge of the ravine. But then she shifted, and the sound she made was not a word, but a breath dragged painfully from lungs that had forgotten how to hope. He approached slowly, rifle lowered, boots sinking into damp earth, his senses trained by habit to search for threats, even though his heart already knew there were none left here. Only aftermath. Her hair was tangled and matted with dirt, her face streaked with dried tears and soot, and one side of her mouth trembled as if she were holding back a scream she no longer believed would matter. When she looked up at him, her eyes did not widen in fear. They were flat, emptied, the eyes of someone who had begged before and learned that begging only prolonged the inevitable. She repeated herself more clearly this time, as if correcting a misunderstanding. "Just kill me fast." The soldier swallowed, feeling something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with fear. He told her she was safe, though the word tasted thin and dishonest in a world that had made a mockery of it. She laughed once, a short broken sound, and tried to pull herself upright, but her legs buckled beneath her, and she slid back against the stump with a gasp that turned into a hiss of pain. That was when he noticed the way she guarded her lower body, the way her hands clenched into the fabric of her torn dress whenever she shifted, as if the cloth itself were the only thing keeping her together. He knelt, careful, deliberate, announcing every movement, as though approaching a wounded animal that might bolt if startled. He offered her water. She shook her head. He offered bread. She did not even look at it. She only stared past him, toward the ravine, where the earth dropped away into darkness, and for a terrible moment he understood that she was measuring the distance, weighing the speed of the fall against the mercy she had asked of him. Something in him rebelled against that calculation. He had followed orders that made no sense, had fired when told, marched when commanded, but here, with this broken stranger and her quiet request, there was no uniform voice telling him what to do, and for the first time in years that terrified him more than obedience ever had. He asked her name. She shook her head again, a tiny movement that seemed to cost her effort. Names, he realized, were luxuries for people who expected to be remembered. When a gust of wind lifted the hem of her dress, she flinched hard enough to cry out, and he saw then the raw edge of a wound, the skin beneath angry and distorted, and instinct older than war, older than training, told him this was not something he could ignore. He told her what he needed to do, spoke softly, promised he would not hurt her, and when he lifted the torn fabric, it was not with curiosity or desire, but with the same grim focus he had used on the battlefield when checking a fallen comrade for signs of life. What he saw stole the air from his lungs. Burned into her flesh was a brand, crude and unmistakable, the symbol of a roaming militia whose cruelty was whispered about even among soldiers, hardened by atrocity. The mark was not just a wound. It was a message meant to outlive pain, meant to follow her wherever she went, announcing to the world what had been done to her and daring anyone to deny it. The soldier's hands shook as he let the fabric fall back into place, and for a moment he could not speak, because anger rose in him so fast and so fierce it threatened to break the careful distance he had learned to maintain just to survive. She watched his face, reading his reaction with the weary precision of someone accustomed to judgment, and she nodded as if confirming a truth she already knew. "Now you see," she said, not accusing, not pleading. "It doesn't come off. He surprised himself by answering immediately, by saying, "It doesn't define you," even though he was not entirely sure he believed it yet. She closed her eyes, turned her face away, and whispered that she was tired, tired of hiding, tired of running, tired of seeing people's eyes change when they noticed the scar. She told him they had burned it into her when she refused to kneel, when she refused to become useful in the way they demanded, and that every mile she walked afterward felt like carrying their hands on her skin. The soldier listened, because interrupting felt like another violence, and as she spoke, fragments of his own memories surfaced. Villages emptied overnight, orders shouted over gunfire, the weight of guilt that settled in his chest long after the smoke cleared. He told her he would not kill her. He said it quietly, firmly, not as a command, but as a fact. She asked why. He searched for an answer that did not sound hollow, and finally said the only thing that felt true, because the world had taken enough from both of them, and he would not help it take more. Night crept in around them, the temperature dropping, and he built a small fire with practiced hands, shielding the flame until it caught, then feeding it slowly, carefully, as if tending something fragile and precious. He wrapped her in his spare coat despite her weak protest, ignoring her embarrassment, and sat close enough to share warmth without crowding her. To fill the silence, he spoke of things that had nothing to do with war, the river near his childhood home where the water ran so clear you could see the stones shift beneath it, the smell of bread baking in the early morning, the way his mother used to hum when she thought no one was listening. At first she did not respond, but gradually her breathing slowed, the tension in her shoulders easing as exhaustion claimed what fear had guarded for too long. When she slept, her head tipped toward the firelight, the scar hidden beneath cloth and shadow, and the soldier stayed awake, staring into the flames, feeling something unfamiliar settle over him. It was not hope, not yet, but it was the faint, stubborn refusal to accept that this endless taking, this quiet despair, was all the world had left to offer. And if this moment, this collision of two broken lives in the aftermath of cruelty, has pulled you in and made you want to know what happens next, remember to subscribe to the channel, because this story is only beginning, and every chapter ahead dives deeper into the cost of survival and the power of choosing mercy when everything else has failed. Morning came slowly, as if the world itself was reluctant to wake and remember what it had become. And when the pale light finally crept through the trees and touched the ravine, the soldier realized he had not slept at all. Yet he did not feel the familiar bone-deep exhaustion, only a strange alertness born of purpose. Because for the first time in a long while, his watch had not been about enemies or orders, but about guarding a single fragile life that trusted him enough to remain where he was. She stirred as the fire died down, a sharp breath catching in her throat when pain reminded her of itself, and her eyes flew open with a flash of panic until she saw him still there, sitting exactly where he had been, his back against a rock, his rifle resting untouched beside him. For a moment they only looked at each other, the silence thick with everything that had been said and everything still waiting to be spoken. She seemed almost confused to find herself alive. Wrapped in his coat, the night passed without violence, and he could see the question forming behind her eyes before she finally asked it aloud. "Why didn't you leave?" He answered honestly, because lying felt like another kind of abandonment. He told her that walking away would have been easier, and that was precisely why he stayed, because easy choices had led him to places he could no longer justify. He offered her water again, and this time she drank slowly, grimacing but determined, and when she finished, she whispered her name so softly it was almost lost to the morning air, as if testing whether it still belonged to her. He remembered it immediately, repeating it once under his breath, anchoring it somewhere inside himself like a promise. They moved at a painful pace that day, her leaning heavily on him, every step a negotiation between pride and necessity, and he adjusted without comment, letting her set the rhythm, because he had learned the hard way what happened when strength tried to drag weakness forward too fast. The land opened up as they walked, the ravine giving way to fields choked with weeds and the skeletal remains of what had once been a farm. And when the outline of an abandoned house appeared ahead, she froze, her grip tightening on his arm, her breathing quickening as memories clawed their way to the surface. He did not urge her on. He stood with her until her shaking eased, until she nodded once sharply, and together they crossed the threshold into the dim interior. Dust motes swirled in the light filtering through broken boards, and the place smelled of old wood and neglect. But it offered shelter, and that was enough. Inside, away from the open sky, she finally spoke of the brand without flinching, told him how the men who burned it into her had laughed as if cruelty were a language. They shared how they wanted her to wear it as a warning to others and a reminder to herself that resistance carried a cost. The soldier listened, his jaw clenched so tight it ached, because every word scraped against memories he kept buried, faces he could not forget, orders he could not undo. When she finished, there were no grand reassurances, no promises of justice he could not deliver. Instead, he cleaned her wounds with steady hands, careful and methodical, treating the brand not as a symbol, but as what it was, damaged flesh that deserved care. Days passed in that broken house, measured by the slow return of her strength and the quiet routines they built, together fetching water, gathering what little food they could find, sharing stories that stitched pieces of themselves back into something almost whole. The brand faded from an open wound into a scar, still there, still undeniable, but no longer raw, no longer screaming. She learned to look at it without collapsing inward, and he learned that protecting someone did not always mean standing between them and a bullet. Sometimes it meant sitting beside them while they learned how to live with what could not be erased. When the time came to leave, it was she who said it first, her voice steady, her eyes clear. At the crossroads where their paths diverged, they stood facing each other, the weight of everything they had shared pressing close, intimate, unspoken. She did not ask him to stay, and he did not ask her to follow, because what they had given each other was not ownership or escape, but something rarer, the certainty that neither of them was alone anymore. Even when walking separate roads, she touched the scar once, then lifted her chin and said she would live, not because the pain was gone, but because it no longer defined the end of her story. He watched her walk away until the road bent and hid her from view, then turned in the opposite direction, lighter than he had been in years, carrying with him the quiet knowledge that some wounds do not mark us as broken but as survivors. And if this ending stayed with you, if you believe that even in the darkest places, compassion can rewrite what cruelty tried to finish,